Hey friends, it is 1:30 and we'll start the next session here. So we are deep into schema.org all day, every day, Wednesday. Yeah, so this next session is about some temporal and spatial aspects of schema.org with some thoughts about extensions to schema.org for these concepts. And so there's a bit.ly link here, which is ESIP-summer-2019-schema-2. A lot of dashes, but yeah, feel free to jump in there for notes and links to some of the slides here for this session. Right, okay, so what we're gonna do is I'm gonna introduce some of the temporal work that Doug and I have been doing at EarthCube, and bow down to the work that Simon Cox has done on owl time there. Yeah. And hopefully he'll chime in, and hopefully all you will chime in with your ideas and criticisms and thoughts here. And then Chuck is going to talk about some spatial and maybe some temporal too stuff. I'm not sure. Well, maybe a little bit. Okay. All right. So if you were here at the last session, you heard that there's a Science on Schema.org initiative where ESIP is sort of governing a set of guidance documents on how folks can publish schema.org for their web pages describing data sets and repositories. And as part of an EarthCube project that myself and Doug Fills were a part of and are still a part of, we worked with about a dozen different repositories to help them publish schema.org on their web pages. And one of the, or actually two of the big issues that came up were just questions about spatial coverage or spatial extent, temporal extent, and how they can better express these concepts for the data sets that they have. And so it was clear that the work being done at schema.org for spatial and temporal didn't quite meet some of their needs. And so we thought this is a good opportunity for our community to work on and conceptualize what we need to do there in that space. And so we hope that you join us today and chime in. And we envision this as a very informal chat discussion. So even if we're doing slides, feel free to interrupt us. We've got a mic, and let's just talk about these two topics here. All right, so Science on Schema.org is guidance documents, and we've been toying with the idea that if we need to publish schema.org extensions, we need a place to host them, and that means domain names and URLs that dereference. And so we've had this idea that maybe there needs to be a geoschemas.org domain where we can sort of host some of this information and the context and these extensions of schema.org. And so we'll be introducing that concept today and get your thoughts and feedback on if that's a good idea or not. Okay, are we all tracking? I learned a really awesome question from Andrea Thomer, and that was to ask, are there any clarifying questions? So is there anything that I said that was completely gobbledygook or didn't make sense, so that you have any questions about? No? Okay, cool. Everyone's ready for a lunchtime nap, so this is awesome. We can all, yeah. Okay, great. All right, so I just want to talk just a little bit about temporal extent and the work that Doug, Fills, and I are doing in the EarthCube space. And Doug came to me and said, hey, Simon Cox has already done this with owl time, and it'd be great if we could just use owl time in schema.org. And so this is a quick diagram that's right off of the owl time vocabulary webpage that just sort of outlines the thought process that went on in the development of that temporal coverage. And the idea that I really just want to convey here is that there's an upper level class in that vocabulary called temporal entity, and sort of everything hangs off of that. So whether you're a duration or an instant in time or an interval of time, those are all considered this temporal entity. And so Doug and I thought, well, if we could just hook schema.org into this temporal entity class, then anyone can use owl time in sort of their JSON LD representations of schema.org. Right, that sounds easy, and we thought we were done in 10 minutes until we started to dig in, and it brings up a whole lot of questions okay, so we want to bring owl time into schema.org. How do we do that? And so the first hurdle that we face is, okay, how do we publish an extension to schema.org? And so we've spun up this geoschemas.org domain. And if you go there and click the extensions page, we've listed one extension called Temporal, and there's a context in there. And if I go to the next slide, which you probably can't, let me, oh yeah, it's not even getting bigger. Anyway, so this is the temporal coverage HTML page, and it just sort of outlines what we were trying to do. And one of the things that we were trying to do is allow folks that are dealing with deep time or geologic time to express that the temporal reference system for this temporal extent is, you know, something I think that community says before present. Is that right, Doug? Before present is the temporal reference system. And then some folks use millions of years as a temporal reference system, right? And so we brought that into this extension. And actually, let me just go out to the website. Let's just do it live. Okay, so pulling in owl time, how did we go about doing that? Well, the first question that we had was, should we take the existing schema.org property called temporal coverage and redefine that in our own way to say that you can just put owl time in there? And that was the first way that we had built this little extension, and then realized, well, if we're proposing that and everyone just assumes that if they put owl time in there only and they're getting indexed by Google, Google's going to completely ignore all the owl time stuff, and you won't have a temporal representation in the Google dataset search. And so our second iteration was, okay, well, we have to mint our own property. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, actually, I have a question. I'm gonna
Yeah, go for it.
So what was the class? Oh,
yeah.
Hopefully we don't get back, right? Red light. Red light. Hell no. Is it?
Oh,
yeah.
nice.
There. Oh, there we go. Okay, maybe it's just okay. So what is the top? Is it just off of thing schema thing, or what is the top class of temporal entity? Right.
So we minted this term called geosci time temporal coverage,
Okay.
and it's what we do is we say that the domain is the schema data set. So we're saying, okay, here's a new property that you can use on schema data set, and you can link in a temporal entity, which lets you.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I thought you said there was a schema, there was also a schema time coverage, right?
There is a property in the schema data set.
Okay.
For temporal coverage.
Temporal coverage, and what was that a subclass of, or a subtype of?
It's, I don't know if the properity itself.
Yeah.
I don't know if it has a subtype, but it
or,
only
I mean,
lets
what was the parent type, I guess, is what I'm asking.
A data set.
Data set.
Yeah.
It was off of data set.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, thanks. That's a clarifying question, everyone. Yeah, because I'm
awake. So
okay, so we've minted this property. I don't think anyone's used it because we haven't told anybody, but we're telling you now. Okay, so just a quick question. Who's heard of owl time vocabulary? Raise your hands. Cool. Okay, who has used owl time vocabulary? Raise your hands. Oh, Simon, you killed it. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, anyway, so this is here. There's examples on this geoschemas.org on how you might use this. We're really interested in your feedback about whether, you know, this separate property is the right way to do it, whether even calling it temporal coverage is even the right term. Maybe temporal coverage isn't exactly the right terminology there. So that's a question. Let's see. And we talked about the temporal reference systems. And on this GeoSchemas website, we published the context. So here's the JSON LD context file that you would import into your own descriptions to use this property. Happy to show examples, but really want to just turn it to you and hear your questions or thoughts or jump in on any topic. This is free and open. You can talk about teriyaki chicken if it was good. Yeah, okay, so we've got temporal coverage as the property, as the RDF property. And in some of the extensions that we've seen other folks do for schema.org, they use the SCOS vocabulary to say, you know, whether it's a close match or an exact match or broader or narrower than other terms in schema.org. And so we use the SCOS close match to say that it's close to what schema.org defined as a temporal coverage, but not exactly. Okay, and so we say that the schema.org domain is a data set and that the range is an owl time temporal entity. And theoretically, that should let you publish any type of owl time temporal extent on a data set. Yeah. Did you want to come up here and? Sure, sure. Yeah, so Simon Cox developed this owl time vocabulary. When was that?
Got a dead mic.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a property.
Yeah, it's a property. It's not a class.
So it's a thing property.
Yeah. So I just wanted to illustrate why we thought this was a good idea. And that's because the way that schema.org encourages you to encode these temporal coverages on a data set is a little funky. For instance, let me just make this bigger here. If you have a duration, so if you have like streaming data and it starts at a certain date, they want you to put in this text, 215, November 2015 / ... to specify that you're, continuously streaming. There's no end date. I mean, that's cool. Yeah, go ahead, Simon. Yeah. Yep, that's right. 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 So
I'm sorry, I was shouting and now I can talk.
Yeah,
Sorry.
would you mind repeating that? Because yeah.
So I can repeat that if other people online. Yeah. Okay. So the fact that one of the recommended or permitted range values is a URL means you could point out to a resource somewhere. Now I know schema.org kind of doesn't do blank nodes, or maybe it does. Maybe it does. But I mean that looks like an escape route, or a route to get a richer representation at least. However, it still begs the question, which I think Adam referred to in the first place, is so you refer to something out on the web, but that ain't going to help you in your index, is
right.
it? So.
Yeah. By the way, the other apparently was the range was actually creative work, right? So
Creative work. Yeah.
So data set, I think, is a subset of creative work.
Boo!
Man,
There's going to be some tomatoes thrown.
This is a really tough crowd. No, so the other observation I was just making is that it refers to a creative work, of which I'm assuming data set is a subset of, right?
Yeah.
So that works for anything that's in that creative work hierarchy, right? So it's not just restricted to that.
Yeah. So you can use a URL as a temporal coverage, but what's interesting is that you can't use an object, a linked data object, as the value of temporal coverage, and that's what I'm doing here. Right, so it's only letting you specify a string URL. And so I think this was one of the drivers behind, let's mint a property where we can actually use a representation such as owl time. Yeah.
So for example, you could put in an event. The temporal coverage is Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah, sure, yeah, yep. Yeah, and I think anything that you could express with owl time, so like a specific duration, There's certain levels of granularity in owl time, and happy to turn it over to Simon
Well,
to.
How does owl time handle events, right? Since they're sort of inherently temporal entities. Is there I mean, if I put in event, would it be implied that that time span is the time span of the, um,
Our time scope is very narrow, and deliberately so. This, this is the W3C style of ontology development. Is you have lots of little ontologies, each with a small scope, and then you have to orchestrate them together to say anything useful. But the alternative is a big monolithic thing like schema.org that gets market acceptance instead. But so what you would do there to say event is either you have another type, which is event, which has a temporal entity as its temporal extent or something, or you just subclass or assert, another subclassing relationship with whichever class of these you want. And, I used to care about that, and these days I don't much, because I think, it's all set theory anyway.
Yeah, I actually have an example in the slides coming up.
But that's a really good thought, Beth. Maybe we need to think about how we would link in a named event. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. That's great feedback.
Okay, what do you know? Yes, it's a way that people might look for data that might be important.
Yep.
And also considering that if you want to make this geological or geoscience extension, there are named eras which are frequently used. Oh, it's coming up. It's coming. All right. Good.
This is our way of getting Simon to do the talk for us. Okay, so on this geoschemas.org page, we put up a couple examples of what we think, and based on the feedback that we heard. And so here's just a quick example of how to do just a simple, there's a beginning and an end date, right? And that's different from how schema.org wants you to publish it. And so there's an example there, and we don't need to go into it, but I include the schema.org style, which is beginning date / end date, and the temporal coverage using owl time. And then just as an example, there was a data set that came up where the researcher was only doing the research in the summer across a couple years. And how do you specify that even though the date range is 2012 to 2015, that it was only summer observations? And so there's an example there of how you might do that using owl time too. And we probably screwed it up, so I'm just gonna skip over that. But oh, are you guys interested in that? Okay.
Green. It's green. Excellent. One of about every 3 to 6 months, we get an email from someone saying, how do you describe recurrent things or periodic temporal entities? And the answer is, we didn't, that wasn't on the set of requirements when we did the revision of owl time that we were required to satisfy. And so we didn't address it. But you could imagine how you might use these pieces to build it. But it'd be an interesting little extension. So, the middle 3 months of each year over a period of 5 years is,
right,
meaningful.
Yeah. So what I did here was I said there's a proper interval between 2012 and 2015, or actually the specific dates. So June 30th, 2012, and September 4th, 2015. So I said there's my interval, and the interval contains smaller intervals. So I have, just for brevity's sake, the first summer, the second summer, the third summer, the fourth summer. So I specify in this broader context of 2012 to 2015, the individual summers. so that if a tool wanted to specify that or enable that type of discovery, you could.
And does that work? Is temporal reasoning happening such that I could put in some dates and somebody could figure out that these things overlap or subsume that, you know, that my dates overlap somehow with
Yeah,
yours?
I'm smiling because I so wish I could say yes, but I have no idea of anyone even attempting this. So maybe today is just an opportunity to
Well, that was
start that
Alan's
discussion.
original thing, right? Was to be able to do that sort of reasoning, and so it can be done. I
Right.
guess we would need to have an inference engine working in conjunction with this. Is that a vision?
I'm cool with it. If there's use cases out there, I mean, I don't want to.
There are tons of submissions to ISWC on temporal reasoning. It's not temporal reasoning is problematic. I think the point of this was for discoverability in search, right? So at least you could build search documents or build landing pages or other things that then gave you some sorts of information about those periods and extents and times, right? So. I feel like that what you just said implies that temporal reasoning,
isn't required for discoverability. The problem is that I might say something that isn't exactly those dates that aren't going to get picked up in search that would require temporal reasoning. And I'm not suggesting that we should do that, but I'm just saying that I do think that's the point of doing it, right? Is for discoverability.
This is the same sort of, so think about GeoSparkle, right? So GeoSparkle has the same problem, right? Man, you're gonna get just worked out, right? So, and we should probably just talk later, but as general reference, you can think about this like GeoSparkle, right? That there were extensions to Sparkle to do these RCC8 operations so that you could figure out whether something overlaps or is adjacent to or within. You'd need essentially the temporal sort of equivalent of that, right? Are they in L-time too also? So the relations are there in L-time. Okay, so you would just need the implementation in the Sparkle endpoint to actually do the operation then, right? And it's not, that part is not standard. That would be an extension to Sparkle.
L-time is the sort of temporal cognate of GeoSparkle in that sense. It says there are these relationships, and they are, because they came from Alan, we know they're complete. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, is there anything else on temporal? I feel like I should turn it over to Chuck so we can talk about spatial. But anyway, maybe the takeaway is there's going to be an ESIP schema.org cluster that apparently some of us are running.
Shortly, so please,
and that would be one venue to further the discussion. Certainly always feel free on the Science on Schema.org GitHub repo at ESIP to submit issues there or comments or suggestions. But thank you so much for letting us introduce that temporal work, and I look forward to feedback. So.
Okay, good afternoon. Okay, so I have a confession to make. So I'm at a Catholic university, and we're encouraged to do this quite often. So I'm going to make a confession to you that I'm confused, and that's where essentially this session came out of. Was at RDA. Adam and Doug and I were sitting talking about how to do spatial representations, how to do geometry representations, how to do all these sorts of things in the framework of schema.org. And we realized that there are a multitude of different ways that you could do this, but there's a whole bunch of competing standards and how those fit together. And so that's sort of where this session sort of was born out of. Since RDA, I am also part of a Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence pilot. This is an NSF-funded effort to provide essentially a resource for NSF-funded large cyber infrastructure projects to go to get advice, to get tap expertise on areas that they may not necessarily have in-house. And so a lot of this work was actually done as part of it, sort of an engagement, is what I guess we're calling following this with Neon, right? And so this came out of a little set of what I call mini vocamps, where we sat down and looked at some of the Neon concepts and tried to create some competency questions and see whether or not the data set discoverability would be sufficient in order to figure out, if for a scientist to be able to find the data sets that they're looking for. And so that's part of what's going on here. For completeness, I'll put up the leadership, and I guess I'm now also a co-PI of in some way. So yeah, I don't know how this works, but anyway. And this is the problem statement that you can read off of the page. And the agenda is much like Adam said. This is an unconference, as you very well have seen, right? And so please interrupt. Discussion is great, right? And roughly this is what we're going to talk about. Okay, so start thinking about what, geoschemas. What is this thing? Well, it sounds a lot like what bioschemas is. And so bioschemas was essentially an effort to create extensions to schema.org for the biological sciences, right? And so if you look at bioschemas.org, and I did this in a cursory way, there's a lot of overlap between the bioscience communities and what we're doing, right? I mean, you see data catalog, data set, you see event, you see samples, you see these other sorts of things in what they call a profile. And then the meat parts of this actually are coming in their type extensions, right? And so they have these things that are like biochem entities and chemical substance where they can connect to Chebby, and molecular entities and proteins, and these sorts of fundamental concepts that are vital for bioscientists, but are not necessarily of interest to a broader schema.org community. So the question is, what is the equivalent of the types that would be populated in the geoschema.org that is not covered by schema.org, right? And so I started thinking about this a little bit and started looking at it. And if you look at schema.org, the sort of fundamental geo concept that schema.org has is place, right? So that's thing, place, right? And that's where most of the properties of spatial things sort of lands, right? And in fact, they even have some geo-related entities in their lexicon, right? And then, so they have this idea of a landform, right? And they have an idea of a body of water as a subtype of landform, right? But the actual specific types are pretty limited, right? So we've got body of water, continent, mountain, and volcano for some reason. So this is what schema.org cares about, right? Okay. So this clearly is not going to work for geoscientists, right? Okay. So yeah. So okay. So what else is going on here? So what are the other classes? And I should also mention that if you click on any one of those, they share the exact same properties as the parent place, right? And so there's nothing that distinguishes them between any other place. But if you look at things like hotel or one of these other business, right, under that hierarchy, right, there's extensions to it like hours of operate, all these sorts of things that are relevant to that kind of thing, right? But there's nothing relevant to this kind of thing, right? So the other bit that is sort of tied to place is this idea of geo, right? So it's spatial specification for geometry, right, is tightly coupled in a sense to place, right? And so if you look at the place landing page in schema.org, it's hard to see, but you end up with this thing that's a geo property, and it can either be a geo coordinates or a geometry, right? So I'll sort of zoom in here, and you can see that this is here a geo coordinates, which is supposed to handle lat long. Geo shapes are more complicated things, more complicated geometry. So you can say polygons, you can say lines, circles, sort of other sort of geometric primitives, right? So this is the hook between actually a thing in the world and its geometric properties, right? Okay, so, and as I mentioned, so this is the subtypes of geoshapes, right? Okay, so why does this matter, right? Why does this matter for data set search? And so I'm going to dive into an example that I shamelessly stole from Neon, but they helped me to steal it, so I guess it's okay. So Neon basically has landing pages that basically are ways of understanding how they've divided up the ecosystems in the country, the different sorts of regions that they call domains, and then the sites that fall within those, right? And so they have two concepts of place right there, right? So they have a region sort of concept of place, and then they actually have a field site concept of place. So if you look at something from Neon's landing page, I was actually, when I was doing this, I was like, Washington, what sorts of sites do they have in Washington? Because ESIP's in Washington, and I landed on Abbey Road. I said, oh, this is interesting, right? So the first thing I'll note here, right, is that they have some rich geometric descriptions, right, of the feature, but they also have sub-features, right? And the sub-features are places where sampling occurs, where different sorts of activity occur, and there's a rich amount of information there that place is just not going to cover, right? And if you go down on the landing page, right, there's this really nice description in human readable form of where this is located or co-located, right? Who is the host site, right? There's policy information that's there. And then there's also ecosystem information. So they have site characteristics, they have a history, they have vegetation, soil, climate, on and on, right? And so that's pretty rich. So what happens if I try to Google search for that site? Well, I don't know if you can see this or not, but Google was very helpful and corrected Abbey Road to Abbey Road, and then gave me a knowledge graph reference to, well, the Beatles. So I mean, I love this particular album, so I was happy. But that's not quite what we're looking at. So this Jedi mind tricks and everything from this morning's, carrying on from this morning's plenary talk, right? So these aren't the concepts that you're looking for, right? Those of you keeping track, I have two popular culture references. So we have Beatles and Star Wars. So that should keep you in good graces. Okay, so back to these competency questions, right? So these are us. So let me take a step back, right? So when you're doing conceptual modeling, you like to ground the conceptual modeling in use cases, right? And many times those take the form of what kinds of questions would you like to ask of the data, or how would you like to search for things, or things of that nature, right? And so given the fact that the main requirements for schema.org are essentially to provide breadcrumbs for Google to provide searchers access or discoverability in terms of finding a data set, what might a scientist look for? And so these are the sorts of rough questions that we sort of came up with during our vocamp discussions. And so we said, well, okay, these are the kind of questions. Do we think that, existing schema.org can answer them? And it's pretty much no. And so we started to think a little bit about just a core sort of ontology pattern that then might be extended out and form sort of the basis. And so me sort of, creating a concept map, and it may be a little bit hard to read, but here, let me just go and actually point. I have a pointer. So the key part here is a thing that's a schema.org place that we call a research site. It has research activities, and has a participant that's a research project, which is also part of schema.org pending. And then there's these two subclass bits here to existing spatial standards. So feature of interest, which is for observations in SOSA, and feature, which is part of GeoSparkle. So I'm going to walk through these real quick. Oh, excellent. Thank you. That might save my arms, right? So as I said, research project is a subtype of organization. So that's pretty good. So you can keep track of organizations that are doing activities or people that are doing activities, right? I like ontology patterns as a way of sort of informing of what things should look like. And this is a interesting published pattern, right? And so if you look at, activities have part. they also have a link out to this time thing that we were just discussing, right? So they have a start time and end time. Right now that's XSD date, but you could in fact imagine using the OWL time extensions for that. It also has this idea of a duration, right? The participant relationship is this FOF agent. That also can be an organization, so that's where that research project bit comes. And most importantly is this sort of relationship here between a place, right, and an activity, right? And so that sort of lets you contextualize what's the difference between a research site and, say, my house, right, which is also a place. Well, a research site is a particular kind of place where research activities are done, right? And so this gives you a way of sort of grounding the meaning behind what a site might be, whatever that name might be, right? I'll also note that it also gives you hooks into prov, right? Because you now have provenance information that is usually tightly coupled to activities that occur at locations, right? And so you can also say things linking to that, right? Features, okay, so those are the sort of bottom part of that concept map that I put up. Top part of the concept map we'll talk about in a little second here. So the first thing to note is we've been working actually for a while, but particularly yesterday with the drone data sort of hackathon that we had with OGC standards and upcoming OGC standards. And so this is taken from the Web Feature Service 3.0 candidate recommendation, I guess, is what it would be classified at right now. And so their fundamental thing is collections of features, right? And so that's sort of one context that features use. Where they stole that terminology though was from this document called Spatial Data on the Web, which has this really nice diagram of what a feature really is and some of the very confusing things about this idea of a feature, right? But in this context, we're talking about sort of spatial objects that have some geometry and some information object that are disjoint from one another. And those are essentially the parts, right, that make up this sort of glue that describes spatial objects, right? And so the feature is really a way of giving you a hook to broader things in the world. The same thing with feature of interest, right? So feature of interest is something that comes out of both SOSA, but it's older than that, comes out of O&M, and there's people who know far more about that in this world, in this room. So, but in any case, the sort of fundamental parts that are there are this idea of observations are being tied to features of interest, right? And in particular, you know, the ultimate feature of interest, right? So this is from some work that Simon is currently working on that are extensions to the SSN SOSA work that was done at the OGC W3C working group, right? And so here you can actually, as you saw in the Neon site, you had these instances where you had a feature which may be the entire site, but you had these sub features, and then you may be doing sampling, say, on a particular plant in that sub feature. And so you can now chain these features together to understand the relationship between the different things, between a feature of interest that may be an observation, which may be a plant leaf, which then is part of another feature of interest, which is part of another feature of interest. So this gives us that ability to talk about those sub sections of place, right? Okay, and then the link to the thing that is being observed is this observable properties. And so I'm shamelessly stealing this from, I think Simon may have put this up on his talk at the Semantic Symposium on Monday, but this is essentially the hook to then saying what was observed, right? And so if you remember that landing page for Neon, right, it had this extensive list of things that they measure at this site, right, and things about which they measure things at that site, right? And so this gives you a way of enumerating what those properties are that are actually being measured about things at that site, right? And so these are sort of, and I'm going to stop here for a second because this is the sort of the end of the first, at least the conceptual part of what I wanted to talk about. So this gives you a hook essentially into schema.org, but leverages other sorts of web standards so that you can then used linked data in the proper way, right? So you can take a schema.org markup and extend it essentially using the same sorts of techniques that were done for all time. So given that I've been blabbing for a decent time now, are there questions? Is this clear? Is there comments on the first part?
Look at that, I used it correctly. Waited for the microphone.
Maybe, is there like a wheel that you spin to get like a pin or something? Maybe we should do that next ESUP that.
I want one. Anyways, I just wanted to, a little bit of a clarification and possibly a question, maybe I just missed it.
Okay.
But is there a requirement for a time stamp within this definition? Because obviously a zone is dependent on, and when you go to these other types of feature classifications.
So this is one of the questions of a temporal extent of this idea of place. So there was a pattern that there was something else I had put up here, which I hadn't really decided to include because I was afraid it might confuse things, but there's this idea of a setting, right? And a setting is essentially either a place or a period. And there's been some work on creating logical models for that. And so what a setting does is it's sort of the glue that basically ties together a spatial thing to a temporal thing, right? So you can talk about the Civil War era in the southern United States during a certain period of time. But if you talk about that period in Europe in 1940, it doesn't make any sense, right? And so there's a temporal spatial bounding on that sort of thing. You can think of the same exact thing happening with a research site, right? That there's activities that start, they end, and they basically then have a sort of, it goes back to this indurent perdurant sort of view of the world, that there are these slices essentially of these activities, right? And so that's one way that you can think about it, and that's an active question I have for the community is, do we need some concepts like setting that sort of ground research site and place into that spatial temporal scope? You know, so presumably NEON will have, you know, a lifespan of hopefully a long time, but it will be finite and then it will end, right? And so that site will go back to being some other definition because NEON will no longer be the authoritative agent to provide the definition for what that place is, right? And so that's why this idea of setting, I think, is potentially useful. Does that help answer a little bit, or? Okay.
Bad Dan didn't use a mic then. But anyway, I second him because there's so many different kinds of zones, ecological zones,
Okay.
the Arctic, the Antarctic, the third pole, that all of these things have geographic extent, but a lot of them also are changing over time.
Yeah, exactly.
Where is the permafrost zone? Well, that is very definitely changing over time.
So that is exactly one of the reasons I put setting originally in that concept diagram that you saw at the beginning, was to do that. That was exactly those sorts of use cases that we've been enumerating as part of the what is the cluster called? It's now an ESUP cluster, the cryosphere alignment.
Semantic harmonization.
Semantic harmonization, yes. So if this interests you, definitely come see the ESUP meeting schedule. I think it's a fantastic way of exchanging ideas and issues and things like that.
Yeah, so this looks from the oboe side, and in terms of anatomy and spatial localization of things, features,
yeah,
it looks awfully familiar.
Yeah.
And in a sense, when you look at schema.org's classification of like landforms and bodies of waters as places, but also things, and it's a mess.
It is.
So it's clear that there needs to be a geo-schema thing, right?
Yeah.
But really, in terms of handling this upper level stuff, you mentioned it, perdurance, endurance, and all of that sort of stuff. One tries to avoid it because it's a pain, but one needs it, otherwise you get this. And then again, you can insulate communities from actually seeing it. But this looks awfully familiar. In the cryosemantics working group, we've looked at zones overlapping with the ecosystems, overlapping with the physical astronomical body parts and all of that. And there exists a lot of stuff to work with already, you know. So
Yeah.
I'm sort of like wary about where this is going. Are we going to duplicate it again?
Now,
Why
so
would we
this
do it?
is so this is a good question, right? So, and my view is the answer is absolutely positively not, right? So the idea would be that much like if you look at SOSA SSN, I think that some sensible things were done there in terms of modularity. In terms of if you look at the SOSA turtle, right? It basically is a lightweight schema. It has alignments to domain range from schema.org as annotation properties. It's a very lightweight thing, but compatible with those sorts of vocabularies. So I think what I'm proposing for geoschemas, right? And I'm getting ahead of myself. The end of this talk actually has, I think, some ideas of maybe how we might do this. But the idea would be that it would provide enough hooks that we didn't screw up schema.org. So if schema.org sees that a research site is a type of place, right, then at least it's discoverable in the Google Bing terms of crawling. But the idea then would be there would be a modular bit that then would essentially lift you to things like OBO definitions, like SOSA, like these other sorts of definitions, so that you could then, you know, agents could follow their nose to more rich descriptions of things. So at least that's my view, but I think that's a point of discussion about how that should actually work, and something I'd like to hear views about if we're gonna do this schema.org. So this is just sort of a straw man of what I think we kind of need, at least at what those hooks, if you're gonna play in the schema.org world, right, you need at least some hooks to get you, you know, between the schema.org world and other universes, right? So was there another, I thought I saw another question. Okay. All right. So very quickly, so the other issue, and this is the one that actually started this entire session, was geometry. Okay. And so that was the other leg of GeoSparkle, is that you can specify geometries. So in January, I once again was very confused, and I said, okay, if I look at some work that was done by the Elfie and Selfie folks that we saw this morning, right? That, and you, by the way, their implementation report is, or I don't know if it's an implementation report, the report, the project report, interoperability project report, is fantastic. And I've read a bunch of these, and this one's actually useful to read. Okay. And so one of the issues that they've discovered, right, is that there's 3 different ways at least that you can specify geometries to agents, right? And so there's the sort of geoshape world, which is a way of encoding a schema.org geometry, as I said. There's the OGC blessed way, which is possibly GeoSparkle, which uses things as a string. And actually, I guess a geoshape is sort of a string or URL. And then if you look at GeoJSON, which is what most agents, you know, or a lot of agents are moving toward consuming, and maybe GeoJSON LD, then you now have a different way of encoding geometry, which is arrays, right? JSON arrays. And in fact, the JSON LD 1.1 specification, which is moving quickly, now supports this idea of being able to unpack JSON arrays, right? And so you could have in a specification multiple ways of essentially saying that a thing has a certain geometry, right? And so you could have a right there. I will probably burn my eye out, but this will be okay. Okay, so you probably could, so you can have a JSON sort of way of describing this, right? And this was stolen straight from the example that's in the JSON 1.1 documentation, right? You can have a geo schema coordinate sort of specification of the exact same thing. And then you can have a GeoSparkle thing, which has a string as WKT. So now you've basically, to satisfy all agents in the world, you have to basically specify it like 3 different times, right? And so the question is this really what we want to do, or is there maybe a better way? And I don't necessarily have an answer to that, right? Other than, and this is an example that was then, if you look in that GitHub issue further along, Adam had this sort of response of, well, we could use, you know, additional property value, right, to then at least specify coordinates and do a little bit more with the existing geoshape. But that still seems a little hackish to me. I'm not sure, but that was the other example. And then there was a talk on one of our geosemantics committee telcos, I think either last month or the month before. And so the other way that you might think about doing this is and this was done as part of an experiment with the Geographic Named Information Service. And so the idea is that this thing is very large, and it has very, very complex geometries. And it makes absolutely no sense to serialize those very complex geometries as RDF, right? The databases that are optimized for handling these spatial data work really, really well. And so is there something that we could do that maybe is a little bit better than that? And so what they said was, well, okay, so the standard geosparkle way of dealing with this thing, as I alluded to before, is to do a literal, which is a WKT literal, which is the coordinates. But if I want a more complex geometry, what I can do is, using their terminology, I can say that there's an AGO geometry, which actually is a URI. And that URI, if I actually go to that endpoint, right, I will get back a response which is of a certain type that represents a more complex version of that geometry. And then I breadcrumb the whole thing with a minimum sort of information object, which is a bounding box, so that search agents at least have an idea of the outline of where that geometry is, even though it's not necessarily precise, right? Okay, and so then, as I alluded to, the second part of this is then to use GeoJSON and content negotiation, or WKT and content negotiation. So if you do a curl on that endpoint that was defined before, right, then now you get a more complex representation of that you can actually use for other things. And so the nice thing about this is it's not just limited to, you know, these sort of content types. I can imagine extending this out to more complex geometric descriptions, or even coverages, which are, you know, sort of net CDF or other sorts of types which are more complex, but at least give enough metadata information that search agents could then tell you that this may be of interest to you based on the fact that there's some relationship between the bounding box and more complicated geometries, right? So, okay, and this is the actual presentation I've included there. I think it's actually worth looking through the slides. It's really quite I think useful. Now on to Pierre's question. Okay, so how does
Charles,
in this? Oh, go ahead.
Can I
Sorry.
just interrupt with in relation to the previous slide where you were showing content negotiation? I'm not sure if you're aware or if everyone's aware that another piece of work coming out of the data exchange working group, I'm not involved in this, but which is pushing an RFC out to IETF for an additional HTTP header, which is for content negotiation by schema, if you like.
Okay.
They call it content negotiation.
I've actually
profile.
seen, yeah, that's
okay.
Yeah.
And so the idea there is that you can request the representation of the geometry, for example, in the form that you can use.
Yeah, and I should mention that the other thing that I was digging in this morning is there's also this Hydra Core vocabulary, which is a W3C interest group for creating a linked data description essentially of API. So you can think of it as a linked data description of a version of Swagger or OpenAPI. And they actually have a suggestion for handling also breadcrumbing this content type, but using a linked data description, a little snippet within the document. And so you could think about using that exact same method to extend out in this previous page, right? So here you just know that there's a line string literal, but you don't know what content types may be available, right? And so you could also then provide that breadcrumb to say to an agent, oh yeah, by the way, if you can consume it in GeoJSON or WKT, these are the URLs these are the URIs for those, or the URI and the content type to then request for that document, right? And so that gives you the flexibility to do sort of the same thing, right? I'm going the wrong way. Okay, all right. So this is the most I can't even talk anymore. Hacktacular. This is the word I was trying to say. Portion. Well, the other part was pretty hacktastic too. But this is how the discussion at the bioschemas folks have sort of bridged the gap between the schema.world view of the world and the OBO view of the world. And they're using this idea of additional type and additional property, right? And so this is an example of if they have a type data record and they actually want to say that, you know, it is, say, a protein identity number, right? So they can give it sort of an ID that then you can give additional information according to its, you know, its sort of biochem entity reference, right? So this is where they actually use that biochem entity type that they've defined. And they also then provide a higher level sort of semantic reference. So they use the semantic science integrated ontology, which is sort of a extracted subset of BFO and a little bit of OBO that doesn't necessarily have all of the major things that are associated with BFO. There's holy wars, so this is trying to avoid some of those, right? And so this is their methodology for doing this, and I guess I'm asking, you know, so this is one possibility, but I think that geoschemas part of the discussion would be to figure out if this is the real way to do the sort of breadcrumbing to things that are more descriptive and expressive, or if we need more, right? And where that more might live, or should that be then a discussion point with bioschemas to go to schema.org and say, hey, this as a scientific group, right? There's strength in numbers. We may need something more, right? And so, and demonstrate that. And so that was sort of the last little example. And so the last sort of thing, I've been sort of stalking / enamored with a company called Zuzuko, who have a contract to essentially build out linked data interfaces to statistical data and governmental and city data in Switzerland. And they've done a really nice job of creating a JavaScript-friendly sort of set of frameworks that are easily deployed that then let you create information-rich sort of pages like this. And so the idea is that you could have an information object page, and this is generated solely by a Sparkle query, by just wiring this up to a Sparkle endpoint and iterating through the entities, right? And you can already see that it's an administrative area, which is of type place, but it's also a GeoSparkle feature, right? And so they have a way of basically combining these sorts of things together so that agents, when they basically land on this entity name, you can figure out what agents can figure out what it is, right? And you have a way of exploring it. The other way to do this is something called Fuzzy Link, which I won't go into, but it's also a PuBBY style browser that is related to the genus work. With that, I guess I'm done. So what's next? I guess that's the question that I now pose to the room with, I'm not sure how much time is left, but yeah, so are there comments, questions, thoughts, apples to throw at me, other fruit?
This is a two-part question. The first part is, what do you mean by breadcrumbing exactly? And then when you answer that, I'll ask my second question, maybe.
So this is the sort of follow your nose principle, right? That linked data provides, right? So at least it provides web dereferenceable resources that you can crawl to discover more information, right? And so all of if you look at, you know, this particular breadcrumbing example, which is, I know it's hard to see and I apologize for that, right? That there's actually, if you go to this site, which I encourage you doing, if you click on any of these links that are sort of in red, it takes you to another page, which you can find out more information. And on that page, there's also more links and you can go to another page, right? And so this is a way of being able to, and the last comment I have is that the Zuzuko also has a really nice YouTube video Most of this data is actually structured using the RDF data cube vocabulary. And so I have a really nice example of using this interface to click through to find out what a Sparkle query should actually look like. What entities are you searching for in a graphical, human readable way? And then once you do that, you can plug that into R and Jupyter. And they have a really nice example of then pulling that into a data frame and doing really nice analysis. The problem with just doing a Sparkle query blind, right, is unless you know the actual underlying structure, it's very hard to figure out what's going on. And this gives you a way of sort of interrogating what that structure is with enough sort of contextual information in standards that you can go look at, that then you can make sense of actually how to get at the data. So that's what I mean by breadcrumbing.
All right, so if you go to the previous slide, it seems like this same structure is really applicable to the discussion from the previous session where we were talking about, chaining services.
Yep, it's exactly the same sort of thing, right? That you would want landing pages that are, so the key part here, and this is the other part that I love that the W3C is also doing for their next sets of services, is that they're using content negotiation, right? So when you land on a feature type, you end up with a human readable page by default if you're in a browser, but you can request other, content types, which are either JSON, JSON-LD, GeoJSON, whatever, right? But the human being, as they're trying to figure out what the structure of this stuff is, they at least have some basis to go on, as versus, being sort of blind, right?
And I would assume the human readable or the underlying HTML includes the list of all of those content types that are available, so that the human can figure that out.
So that is the idea. And I think it's what, if they're not doing it already, it's what they will do soon as their templates. So they're basically using, I don't know which, I think they're using Vue.js. There's some subtleties in schema.org in terms of having to have server-side rendering. So if the client actually has to generate the embedded scripting, Google won't always get that, right? Because you have to, it's embedded inside of code, which then has to generate things. So the templating usually has to be generated server-side and then sent as is embedded in the HTML, right? And so what they're doing is they've got a little JavaScript Sparkle query that then populates that schema.org template, so that then agents can at least discover, what this landing page is about. But because URIs that's being populated with are actually breadcrumbs, if you click on that, you end up at a landing page like that, where you can interrogate actually what they're talking about, or you end up at a landing page which may be GeoSparkle. So I mean, it's linked data. So if you're a good linked data citizen like Envo and Sweet are trying to be now, you'll end up with a human readable, sort of landing page to understand what's going on, right? And so there's two parts to this. It's the linked vocabularies adopting sort of these best practices, the 5 stars of linked vocabularies, which is a paper that I wrote at a vocamp many years ago with a bunch of other attendees. So there's sort of those two parts of it. Yeah.
So,
oh, hey.
Yeah, here I have a question maybe for Dr. Simon Cox. So I have a question for you, but actually it's a question from my student. So one of my PhD students, now he's working on streaming data processing. And one day he asked me a really interesting question. Because he know I'm working on some semantic web. So he asked me for a definition of present or now. So how do you define now in semantic web? I could not find a good answer. But then I was reading the documentation of our time, and I see, oh, very interesting. In geology, seems people already fixed the present to the year 1950. That's very interesting. But I don't know, in our time, especially when you think about streaming data, what would you see about the definition of now or present?
The present is now, isn't it? But in answer to something that somebody earlier said, maybe it was Adam, maybe it was you, Charles, I'm not sure. The before, present, and millions of years ago thing is actually, I thought it was simple, and I looked into it in the last month or so, and it's a little bit more complex because the 1950 datum, only matters if you're measuring times to a certain level of precision. When you're measuring millions of years ago, and only to a couple of decimal places, it's noise. Yeah, exactly. In the geological timescale, mostly the 1950 doesn't matter. It only matters for the last 100,000 years or so when you're using carbon dates, which is when it was what it was originally adopted for. So, but that. The issue there really, this is the same thing about the present. That question only becomes complicated, or can really only be defined when you also say something about the precision or the uncertainty which you're interested in. Okay. Now, Pierre might have a view about the full sort of logical descriptions or consequences of these things, but ultimately all of the semantics that we're talking about is just about communication, and so it's the words ultimately that matter and how we mutually comprehend them. So one of the key things in going back to Adam's presentation at the beginning, when you're talking about temporal coverage and streaming data sets, which is the thing you've just brought up, where it doesn't have an end. What's important then is to be able to express single-ended intervals, where what the beginning is, but the end is not defined. Okay, and all of these things are going to be, to a certain extent, use case specific, and there's no way I can give you a single answer to that question.
I'm wondering if the question is more about how do you make sure that your metadata gets updated when the data end date ceases to be now and becomes a date in the past, right? I mean, for some data sets that are currently, they're accreting more data, right? The missions are still flying. It's true that there's a start date and no end date, and the end date is now. But at a certain point, the mission's going to come to an end, and they're going to stop producing more data, and there's going to be an end date. And it seems to me that the real problem is, how do you make sure that your metadata gets updated? Not so much what's now, right? Like, how do you define now? Because now you've just defined it as now. Or am I misunderstanding the problem? Is there something else that is needed? I mean, yeah, I guess, like, it sounded like you were saying, can you put a date in for now? And I'm curious if there's something else that you're after.
Yeah, I think both you and Sam already partly answered my question, I think. And also from my original understanding of my student's question, what he wants is just a start and an end.
Yeah, he wants an interval.
Yeah, but in his understanding, seems now is endless.
Now is it's a conceptual extraction. So if you look at some of the stuff that we did, like in OBO, right, yesterday, with this idea of a waypoint as a sort of a 0 point geometric entity, it's a conceptual convenience, right? But outside of that conceptual convenience of what we perceive as now, right, it doesn't have any meaning for the processors in some way, but it does conceptually ground things. So I think
I've worked with systems though where now was a meaningful.
It was meaningful to the person that put it in, but if I saw it, I mean, what?
Yeah, I think it's easy to get down the rabbit hole there very quickly. I once was a geosemantic symposium in Maine, and we spent 6 hours talking about a long relationship. I don't want to do that again. So, but I think, like, on a practical level, when you have a data object, you generated that and it has an end. You know, it's only about that period of time when you're generating data. I think then for a continuous stream, what is needed on a practical level is a way for that schema.org record to point ahead and say, look out for another one that's coming in this series. And if it's not there, you know, then the series stopped.
Yeah.
You know.
So in just briefly, I'll respond to that because I think that's right. So I think the other thing that's needed is some ways of negotiating policies, right? So the idea that there's some authority behind it and that it's essentially they're stating that I have a guarantee that I will be serving this data between this period. Or if I'm on an NSF grant, you can guarantee you'll be downloading this data for 5 years because I'm obligated to do that. After that, it may or may not be here. So, but at least explicitly exposing that interval, right, as part of the metadata in some way. And that may be this idea of being able to capture policy information is one thing that geoschemas may want to talk about, right? So, okay.
I was debating whether I'd say this or not. So what Marshall's referring to is what's called present time.
Okay.
Compared to present location. Compared to current location, which is a mixture of time and location. And the challenge here is sort of the conceptual representation of what are you using it for. So we go around with handheld devices or we bring up a map program, you'll see it says current location. So but actually it's semantically incorrect because if you move, it still has the dot on your previous location from the timestamp. So there's a lot of subtlety here. The main thing I think is how you're going to capture the data that fits in this slot that actually has some useful meaning. Really. And so what I'm talking about is you're trying to semantify an adjective, which is a noun, but it's a modifier to it, and that is always the biggest challenge. So that's why SCOS exists, because it gives you this sort of a little bit more vague representation without specifying the exact relationship. And if you're going to do that, in the spirit of schema.org, I suggest you go a little bit more vague to give the opportunity to do late binding, i.e. it means something when I'm going to go and use it, as well as it means something when I'm going to actually instantiate it. Hope that made sense.
Like, is there a new standing on the wall?
That's certainly the case, bad backs. One comment, to a certain extent, addressing what Peter was saying and Pierre as well. When we put together O&M, which then carried over into SSN and SOSA, taking advice, particularly from the meteorologists, who, when they do forecasts, have loads of times that they need to associate with a data set. We picked out, we picked out a couple of them and said, these are ones which often when you're dealing with data, you need to distinguish. And they were called phenomenon time and result time. And the one is the time which applies in the world, and the other is the time when the data system was updated, if you like. And that, you know, is more important in some applications than others, the case that Peter just gave us there. But time's a tricky thing.
And I think part of the point also there is that SOSA and some of these other efforts have wrestled with these, right? And it would seem to me that at a schema.org level, that it would, because these things are very tricky, it might be something that should be used in terms of connection, this idea of connection to other things, which have the correct machinery behind it, right, and structure to be able to say something meaningful about time or about place or about these things, right? And so that's why there were these hooks as I was going through here, that hooking to SOSA, right, which is been a thoughtful way of thinking about observations, right? Hooking, as Adam said, to time, which, you know, has a thoughtful way of talking about these things. Hooking to things in OBO Foundry, for biological entities, which have thoughtful ways of talking about these things outside of the scope of discoverability for necessarily for schema.org, right? So. Other comments? Yes.
A while ago, you asked the question of, well, what do we do next?
Yep. And I was about to go back to that.
And so I was thinking that what's needed are enough examples worked to have a clue whether this is going to work or not.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a couple of funded activities that I'm staring at in the room that could help with that, but it would be good if they had, you know, other community members who are willing to contribute, you know, on use case. I mean, there are easy use cases and there are interesting ones. And I guess I usually am interested in the interesting ones. But in any case, that would be a way forward if we could find.
So that's one thing. And then the second thing I actually wanted to sort of bring up with what's next is there's also the sort of structure and governance of what geoschemas.org presents itself, right? There's a whole bunch of infrastructure that Bioschemas has thought through in terms of creating sort of this templating system where you start at a Google Sheet. It's already sort of aligned in ways to schema.org, so you're bounded at least in that regard, knowing that your hierarchy will fit into that thing sort of schema, right? And then they can generate essentially schema.org compatible documentation. So schema.org has this really sort of funky sort of structure, right? That is a little bit different than other sorts of ontologies, so to speak, right? And so there are these sort of mechanistic things out there which also could be leveraged if there's interest in that, right? So the real question I think is twofold. You know, what does it contain and what does it look like and how do you access it? I guess threefold, right? So I think Pierre has a.
Yeah, so I don't know. Schema is moving, right? And so, but we also see the opportunity for geoscience in particular, because if they have just those few classes, right, it's a space where a community like this should go in and say, look, you know, we have a forum to get this sorted out to a degree. But I also like take on Beth's earlier point. If you're thinking about things like reasoning and stuff, that's when you need those references to artifacts which you can actually reason over without overburdening the schema.org specification, because that's not the point, right? And then, so I think that's the thing about what's next is having a conversation with bioschemas, thinking about the geoschema presence, and then approaching schema.org saying, hey, look, we got ESIP here, E2SIP is emerging down under, and Europe is going to have its ESIP thing emerging too. And so we have a global community that can help this out. So, you know, I think we have to make a presence, make the presence felt.
I think that's a good point. Just to comment on reasoning, right? So Peter Patel Schneider did a presentation, I think 2015 Semantic Web Conference in Italy, where he did a formal analysis of the underlying structure of schema.org. And it's, maybe I'll put it in some of the notes somewhere. It's actually worth reading through what his conclusions were, particularly in terms of the formal model behind it and the fact that it really doesn't have a grounded formal model like, you know, OWL or the sort of semantic web groundings. And most of the annotations they have are, other than subclass relations, are annotation properties, right? So even their domain range restrictions are annotation properties. And so there's not a lot of logics that you can really do with them. And that's why you need these, well, for lack of another better term, breadcrumbs to things that are more explicit, that then you can use linked data to follow your nose, discover those more explicit things, and then use those for the applications that require reasoning and logics. Okay. So in case you didn't hear that comment, EML also has that same sort of idea of being able to you know, punt to something that's more expressive if your application needs reasoning. Yep.
So I guess my question is we have a newly formed cluster that has spun up. Is that the venue for all of this? Should the formative meeting include all of these areas and figure out where the community wants to go? Or that's sort of the start of your organizational question, I guess, is the...
That was part of the start of the organizational question, right? Now, Alistair Gray, who I think is leading the bioschemas effort, we've met several times, and I actually scared him because he was giving a presentation on semantics and chemistry, and I'm a chemist. And so when he discovered there was a chemist in the room, there was some degree of concern, but he did well. But he's, as near as I can tell, leading parts of the bioschema effort. So I think one of the things is also to start to connect to the other communities, particularly the bioschemas, but also there's the Internet of Things community, which actually have iot.schema.org, which is a little bit even more blessed than bioschemas in terms of their integration with schema.org. And there certainly is overlap with the Internet of Things community in terms of observations, measurements, all these sorts of things that would also be of interest to this community. So there's an internal community, which I think we need to drive things forward in a consistent way. But then there's also the sort of external hooks of people who share the exact same needs in many cases, right? So.
And I guess my last concern, and I don't think we actually came to a decision there, but
we didn't.
Okay, but is how many people here are from a data center that if anything, any of this went forward, and it was easy enough to do, you might do some of it in the foreseeable future? Quite a few? Okay, that's way more than I thought.
I see a lot of hands, so.
Okay, that's good news because I was worried about that. So the question is, can we get enough participation from that group that we don't go too off into the weeds and make it something that real places can't do?
So let me also say this. I'm also going to give a pitch for, I guess, some of my involvement, right, in the Cyber Infrastructure Center of Excellence, right? And so that's one of the things that we've been sort of tasked with by NSF is in relation to large cyber infrastructure projects is with exactly these sorts of issues where, and it's not just, the bio community, but also the physics community. It's all of these other sort of NSF funded efforts that can learn from each other. And that's why they want to fund eventually, we hope, a full-blown center of excellence where it provides a resource where NSF funded large cyber infrastructure projects and even, I guess, small cyber infrastructure projects can come and get advice about how to do schema.org, get advice how to do vocabularies, how to publish their vocabularies, how to structure their data, how to run workflows, best practices, how to ingest and store data, how to do data preservation policy, right? So that's one of the thrusts, right? And so, so I would encourage you, if this sounds promising to you, if you know your friendly NSF program officer, mention the CICE pilot to them that this might be a useful thing going forward to provide those sorts of resources. But I could also see that as also an anchor point that we might be able to provide for the next year. So. Yes.
From the OGC perspective, so
yep,
L time can be considered an OGC specification.
Yep. SDW working group.
Yep. Same for SSN. I think GeoSparkle.
No, that's an OGC standard.
That's an OGC.
Yeah.
So.
But it should be, there should be so there's been talk about revisions to GeoSparkle, and that would come into the auspices of SDW. That's my understanding. So.
But what I'm looking at here is you're depending on some stuff that with
Yes.
the OGC hat
Oh,
on,
100%.
we're generating. So we have,
Yeah.
I think we have, as the OGC, have a responsibility to support what you're doing in part, you know. And it's one of the things that came out of Alfie was we can't do this linked data stuff unless we move our specifications to proper RDF formalism, and then we can build JSON LD contexts and that kind of stuff. So some of what you're trying to do with geoschema.org could probably fall under under their purview, and actually maybe, you know, could be hosted and managed by the naming authority too.
That would be, I think, quite nice. So this the other issue is persistent identifiers and making sure that any of the products that come out, you know, ESUP has been very good with the cores, you know, repository and being able to do contributions and stuff like that. And I think they've guaranteed it for a certain lifespan. But I think having OGs, the more the merrier, right? And so I think that, and also visibility, right? So this raises the visibility to an entirely new group, right, which could, you know, leverage a lot of these concepts, even in industry partners, those sorts of things, which are in some cases more active in OGC, right? So.
Yeah, and I think there's something quite nice for us in the Alfies as well, because we recognize the need to do similar things with our time and so on. So we did spin up our contexts and smuggled those, you know, data structured that way into our stuff.
Yeah.
What we didn't look at was the, you know, kind of explicit binding into schema.org, and be grateful to revisit that in our context. So I don't really understand the motivation fully. But.
Okay. Well, we obviously we're
Just give a quick pitch to the next session. So I just wanted to give a quick pitch to the next session here at 3:30 on the harvesting side of schema.org, and feel free, Dave, if I misspeak about your session there. But I think, you know, the questions that Ruth brought up about, you know, what's the next steps and how do we converge? I think the next session will be a great opportunity to talk more about that. You know, so we can talk and decide all we want on what we want to do as publishers, but if there isn't some harvester that's willing to use that in some mechanism, whether that's now or even down the road, that's an interesting topic for discussion. And so I really encourage you to continue the conversation at 3:30 and come check out what we need to do. Because I think convergence as a community on standard, or I hate that word, that's a terrible word. Convergence on, you know, a consistent way of us publishing as a community is an interesting idea. So Philemon, go ahead. Say again, did someone hear? I think it's being formed as we speak, right? So it's probably in the womb, and maybe it'll be born by. The sentences have been sent. I know. The sentences have been sent. Yeah. So it's on Mike's shoulders here. So. So lastly, again, in case you aren't joining us for the next session, I just wanted to, again, present the opportunity to talk more about schema.org at AGU. I hope you submit sessions. Don't let the title of this session scare you. I think we were slightly drunk on something when we wrote this, so it feels very techie, but please jump in and contribute your thoughts at AGU at this session. So.
CICOE also had a session on cyber infrastructure and the earth sciences that was also accepted. And there's some, I think, some nice crossover there on how we actually build tools so that you can actually do these things in reality in cyber infrastructure. So that would be another part of the discussion of the tools like what Adam and Doug have actually built, Gleamer, these sorts of really nice bits of cyber infrastructure code. So I think Ruth has one more comment.
Test.
All right, well, I won't be able to exactly repeat that, but my thought is that we have this new cluster forming, and there are a lot of people from repository type worlds in this room who might be interested in implementing this if it came out to be a reasonable thing for them to do. And so I was suggesting that perhaps all of those people should join this cluster and might want to volunteer to be like a co-chair or something of it to spread the load around and make sure things are headed in the direction where you need them to go. Just a thought.
Well, with that, thank you very much, and enjoy, if you don't come back, enjoy the rest of your